While we're setting Kate up as a panelist, I'd like to just introduce her. So I've known Kate for a few years now through our interest in mammals in the mammal world. So Kate is the head of conservation development in Ireland for the NGO, the Vincent Wildlife Trust, and they're a key player in research-led conservation of several of our Irish mammal species. And Kate has been at the forefront of the conservation of the Lesser Horseshoe Bat in Ireland since the mid-1980s. And her work with the Vincent Wildlife Trust sees her managing 12 reserves for the Lesser Horseshoe Bat, which she's going to talk about today. So we're really delighted to have Kate on the line. And we're really looking forward to this talk titled Woodlands and Runes Under Dark Skies. And I think it's going to give us a great insight into the really important work that Kate does, and maybe a glimpse into the world of the amazing creatures that are the Lesser Horseshoe Bat. So you're very, very welcome, Kate.
Thanks very much, Mags, and thanks to the other organisers of Mayo Dark Sky Festival 2020 for inviting me to participate. I think it's very appropriate that we should have some bats featured during a Dark Skies Festival, as you'll see later on. My talk is going to weave together a few themes, but connecting these is this little animal, the Lesser Horseshoe Bat. It is one of 9 species that we have in Ireland, but it stands out from the others in a number of ways. Firstly, it has a very distinctive face because of the horseshoe-shaped disc of cartilage around its nostrils, which gives them their name. I'm not sure if my cursor is working, but if you can see, there's a horseshoe-shaped disc here, and then there are 2 other sections of the nose leaf, one part in the center called the sella and a triangular shape called the lancet. And the bat uses these parts, this nose leaf, to direct its echolocation call, which it emits through the nostrils. Now, like all Irish bats, the Lesser Horseshoe Bat produces its echolocation calls at a high frequency, beyond our hearing range. But we can eavesdrop on these ultrasonic sounds by using bat detectors. There are different types. The one I've described here is a heterodyne detector. And if we tune our detector to 110 to 113 kilohertz, the Lesser Horseshoe comes across as a beautiful melodic warble, unlike any of the other bats. The calls produced at this frequency attenuate rapidly, so you do have to be quite close to the bat to hear it, but they are perfectly adapted to flying within clutter using these highly focused echolocation calls. These bats are also very sensitive to movements in the environment, such as the wing beats of flying insects. And another curious feature of them is that their ears move independently of each other. So while one ear is pointed forwards, the other one can be pointing backwards in order to pick up returning echoes. Now, another very obvious difference is that while bats can hang free, the Lesser Horseshoe Bat is the only bat that always hangs free. And that's because they have limited quadrupedal movement, which simply means that they cannot land and crawl on all 4s like the other bats. And that's why we always see them hanging free in a structure. Sometimes they have their wings closed partially around their body, sometimes more closely. In this photograph, you'll see, well, you might just be able to see something else peeping out from the wings, and that's actually the tail end of her pup, her baby. But later on, we'll see images of the bat where the wings are very, very closed over it, but no other species in Ireland does this. They're also the only Irish species with such a limited distribution within the country. They're restricted to 6 western counties, Mayo being the most northerly, and then we move down through Galway, Clare, Limerick, Kerry and Cork. So all along the western Atlantic seaboard, or the wild Atlantic way. And in fact, Mayo represents the most northerly distribution point for the Lesser Horseshoe Bat anywhere in the world. We find the Lesser Horseshoe throughout Europe. We travel through Eastern Europe, we go over even as far as Kashmir. It's found in parts of Africa, but we're very lucky to have a species that is originally a tropical species in Ireland along the west coast. And it's also probably the Irish species that's most dependent on our rural landscape and on unintensive farming, where we have the bats in lowland areas where there's a rich network of connectivity as regards hedgerows and stone walls and trees. Its preferred habitat, as we'll see later, is broadleaf woodland. And the final feature to mention at this point, and one very relevant, I think, to this festival, is that it is probably the most photophobic bat in Ireland. It is so averse to light. Artificial illumination really restricts its movement, and I'll come back to that later. Now, I know that decluttering has become a very popular activity this year when we've all been confined to our houses and we realise we've far more stuff than we need. But in the case of the Lesser Horseshoe Bat, it seeks out cluttered environments. And in the world of a bat, a cluttered environment is this. It's a deciduous broadleaf woodland with many trees and densely packed together. So it's a cluttered environment, and this is where the bats will find their food and will be able to move around the environment. The wings are perfectly adapted to this type of habitat, which you can imagine could be difficult for other species to move around in. Wings are short and broad, and this enables them to fly quite slowly through the vegetation, but they're also highly maneuverable. So they're able to quickly twist and turn, whether they're chasing an insect or trying to avoid a branch of a tree. And I don't think I've ever seen a photograph of a Lesser Horseshoe Bat in flight that didn't also have vegetation or some other physical structure beside it or alongside it. And I've never encountered a Lesser Horseshoe Bat at night that wasn't flying along vegetation. And the reason they do this is to avoid being predated. Because they're slow flying, they could be easily picked off by a bird of prey. And so they fly along these linear features as a form of protection. Lesser horseshoe bats hunt insects by chasing them on the wing. As you can see here in the photograph, there's a bat about to close in on a crane fly or tupulid. And this form of hunting is called hawking. But they also do what we call perch hunting, which is where they will hang up from a branch, or hang down, probably more correct to say, hang down from a branch, producing echolocation calls through their nostrils. And then when an echo returns, indicating an insect might be approaching, they will fly out and catch it and bring it back to the perch and remove the inedible parts, such as the wings and the legs. They feed on a variety of insects, thankfully. They're a generalist feeder. So they'll take small insects, small midges, crane flies, as we see here. They eat moths, but also insects associated with aquatic habitats, such as caddisflies and lacewings. And they will feed along water bodies, such as rivers and lakes and streams, where there is vegetation, both for availability of food, but also for protection. So where does a lesser horseshoe hang out when it's not out hunting? Well, the answer is primarily in ruins. And the definition I discovered recently of the word ruin is that it's originally a Latin word meaning collapse and refers to the collapse of human-made architecture. So this could be a single building, as in this case, or it could be an entire city, either by a natural event such as an earthquake or volcanic eruption, as in Pompeii. The ruin structures are mainly where we find lesser horseshoe bats because there are openings for them to fly into, and they're usually away from artificial lighting, and they're usually unoccupied by humans because the lesser horseshoe bat is extremely sensitive to disturbance. So it tends to seek out dark areas of old buildings. Now, there are exceptions, obviously, to this, but generally the buildings where you find humans and lesser horseshoes are very, very big, vast structures, and we'll see one of those later on. So the type of buildings we find them in range from this, which is, we'll again see this in more detail later, beautiful old period dwelling, multi-story with a basement underneath, to other stone buildings. This is a beautiful stone building with slated roof, but you can see that the vegetation was beginning to devour the building. To smaller buildings, this would have been a former dwelling, formerly thatched, and then when the thatch deteriorated, there would have been galvanized sheeting attached to that. And then on the left-hand side of this, you can see there's a very small farm building. Again, the ivy's beginning to encroach. And then on the right-hand side, you can see, you'll have to take my word for it, but there is a building buried under all this vegetation. And then finally, this, you find them in structures like this, where they're literally collapsing around their ears. The stone has collapsed, and yet there were still lesser horseshoe bats using it. In fact, 4 of the buildings I've just shown you have been acquired by Vincent Wildlife Trust and repaired, and are being used by the bats. The one thing that all buildings or structures used by lesser horseshoes have in common is that the bats can fly directly into them. I mentioned earlier that they have limited quadrupedal movement, so they need to be able to fly directly into a structure, and the opening needs to be at least as wide as their wingspan. Often people say, well, do you find lesser horseshoe bats in bat boxes? Well, you definitely do not, because they simply cannot land and crawl into them, but they will certainly hang from them if the opportunity presents itself. They use these buildings in summertime, and this is where the females form what we call maternity colonies. And they move into them in April as the weather's improving, and they're there in May, and then by June they begin to give birth to their one young, which is called a pup, and the births can continue into early July. The females suckle their young, and on the left-hand side of this, you can see there's a female looking down at us, and she has what is quite a well-developed juvenile who's still quite happy to hang from its mother. There's a difference in colour of the coat, so even if the bats weren't together like this, and we saw a grey bat and then a brown bat nearby, we'd be able to say that one of them is an adult, because the adult fur colour is grey, and the young bats are brown until they have their first moult the following spring. Now, when the females are suckling their young, and this can be up to 6 weeks, they maintain a constant body temperature, which is like ours at 37 degrees. But if they're not suckling a young, if they're not breeding because they're taking a year out, they don't always breed every year, or they may not be mature enough yet to breed, or they could be male bats in the roost as well. During cold spells in the summertime, and we all recognize that we can have cold, wet spells during the summertime, the bats that don't have high energy needs can lower their body temperature to save energy. And when we see bats, as you can see on the right hand side here, where they're inactive and they've pretty much closed their body or enclosed their entire body within their wings, this means that they have lowered their body temperature for a period of time in order to save energy. And it's a very important survival mechanism for bats in temperate areas like Ireland, where we can have a lot of variety of weather, let's put it that way, during the summer months. But a period of longer inactivity is certainly during hibernation. And although all of our Irish bats hibernate, the only one we know anything really about is the lesser horseshoe, and that's because we can see it out in the open. So I was intrigued by Michael's lecture about the chambers that he has found. And I just wonder, I know he's been focused looking down for fossils, but I just wonder, has he ever looked up with a powerful torch to see that there be some little black bodies hanging down, and there could be lesser horseshoe bats there too. So lesser horseshoe bats hibernate in a range of underground sites, but by far the more suitable for them are natural caves. And that's because these provide stable, cool temperatures, regardless of what's happening outside weather-wise. So a cave like this would be about 8 degrees centigrade, which is perfect hibernation temperature for a lesser horseshoe bat. So the bats will enter these from about October onwards. And during hibernation, it's not a deep sleep. It's quite a different period or a physiological condition of the animal, in that they not only lower their body temperature to 8 degrees from the phenomenal 37 degrees that it normally is, but they'll also reduce their heartbeat, they'll reduce their respiration rate. So there's tremendous physiological conditions underway in the bat, and that enables them to survive on the fat reserves they've laid down on their body over the winter. And again, it's a very important survival mechanism. Now, I mentioned earlier that lesser horseshoe bats are extremely photophobic, and all bats are nocturnal and well adapted to life in darkness. And it's primarily, again, as I said, to avoid predation. Some bat species, however, are able to fly faster, and they have echolocation systems that alert them to the presence of a predator so they can take evasive action. So you will find these bats flying in more open conditions around the edges of trees, and even around street lighting, because they're attracted to that because the insects have been sucked into the artificial light and they can feed on them, but they are taking a risk of being predated themselves. Lesser horseshoes, however, slow flight, highly directional echolocation system, they seek out linear features. They do fly in the open, but only when it's completely dark. And to explain a little bit more about their reaction to light, this graph is taken from our conservation handbook for the lesser horseshoe that we produced several years ago. And it shows an experiment conducted by my colleague, Dr. Henry Schofield, who is looking at the heights at which bats, lesser horseshoe bats, were willing to fly under varying light conditions. And in this case, he was looking at under what light conditions will the bats feel confident, safe to fly across 5-meter gap. That may not seem much, but it's quite a gap for a lesser horseshoe bat to fly across. So to draw your attention to the right-hand side of the slide, we have light levels measured in lux at 20. And we see that the bats are beginning to fly, but they're staying very low to the ground at 1 meter. And then as we move across the slide towards the left-hand side, we will see that as the light level drops and drops and drops, the bats are able to fly higher. And at 0.3 of a lux, they're happy to be flying at a more suitable height for them for hunting their insects. This summer, with a small grant from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, we were able to undertake a study, and this was undertaken, a modelling study by Dr. Donald Finch, to look at the factors influencing the current distribution of lesser horseshoes in Ireland. And for this, we were supplied with data on the density of artificial lighting by all of the local authorities in the study area, and we're extremely grateful for this data. And the results from the study showed that Limerick has the highest density of street lights per metre squared, whereas County Mayo has the least, which probably won't come as a surprise to many of you because of its status as a dark sky park. And that leads me to one of the most important sites for the lesser horseshoe bat in County Mayo. This is the first lesser horseshoe roost in Mayo that I visited when I began working for the Trust in 1991. So it holds a very special, has a very special part in my heart for lesser horseshoes. It was built by the Moore family in the 1790s, and it's located on the eastern shore of Lough Cara, about 10 kilometres north of Ballinrobe. Now, much has been written about the family who built it and lived there. Nearby, there's a commemorative stone commemorating the activities of John Moore, who was involved in the 1798 Rising. And on the other side, I'm showing you the cover of a fascinating book about his great-grandnephew, George Moore, who was a writer, art critic, dramatist, and he, along with W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory and Edward Marten, was responsible for setting up the Irish Literary Theatre. Now, I knew nothing about any of this fascinating history when I first visited it, because my first port of call was in fact to this beautiful stone building. It's in the grounds of Moore Hall Estate, which is now owned, managed by Mayo County Council. Back in the 1990s, this was managed by Quilcha. And I was concerned for this building because previously lesser horseshoe bats had been using it as a summer breeding site. But by 1991, the roof had deteriorated. It was very drafty, open to the elements, and wet. So I was only working for the trust a matter of weeks really, and I very cheekily applied for funding and received it because of the importance of the site. And we were able to do a small amount of repair work to the roof, but we also secured the building to make it warmer and safe from disturbance. And the numbers appearing here represent the numbers that have been using it over time. Now, the term pre-parturition describes the period before the females give birth and before, obviously, the young are on the wing. And we, along with the rangers of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, we conduct monitoring of the adult bats emerging from these buildings between the end of May and the beginning of July, because this gives us an idea of the surviving adult population from year to year. Many of the young don't survive. So we sit outside these buildings at dusk during those weeks for one or two occasions with our bat detector and our headphones on, and we count out the number of bats. In 2004, there was a maximum number recorded of 335. But then there was a decline noted in 1999. And this represented, again, when the roof had deteriorated because of a storm that year. So once again, the trust paid for a small amount of repair work to be done just to keep the bats in the area. And then thankfully in 2009 and 2010, the National Parks and Wildlife Service were able to fund the re-roofing, entire re-roofing and restoration of the building for the bats. And this summer, the ranger counted out 210 bats. This must be one of my favorite photographs because it represents the time when work was being done at the barn. It would have been part of the farm element of the estate when the Moore family were there. And it just meant that, for me, that the population was going to be secured for many years to come. What's so important about Moore Hall for the bats is that they have everything they need within a kilometre, even a couple of 100 metres. This is the basement, a basement section of Moore Hall ruin. So that was that beautiful photograph I showed you at the beginning. So underneath that building, we have the basement section. And this would have been where the servants lived and slept. It's where the kitchen was, and it's where the wine cellar was. And there are beautiful vaulted ceilings in this section, but not many of them have still got plaster intact. So there's a lot of rain getting in, and this is seeping down through the building. So some of the other sections, when you look in and look up, you see the bricks, and they're soaking and water is dripping down. But thankfully there are two sections, particularly this one, where it's still relatively dry, and this is where the bats hibernate in mild winters in Mayo. And the numbers, in 2010 we only had 88, and this corresponds to when we had a severe cold spell. There was a temperature reading from Strade in County Mayo for Christmas Day of minus 17.5, which is unheard of temperatures for the west of Ireland, or even any parts of Ireland really. So it is obvious that the bats, it was just too cold for them to stay here. They would have died of hypothermia. So they must have found alternative places to go. And again, I'm wondering, are they using some of those chambers that Michael mentioned? Because we know that there aren't very many natural caves in the area. But they obviously had somewhere else to go, because this winter, 10 years later, there was a phenomenal 808 bats hibernating. Now, while we have mainly mild winters and the bats are doing fine, what I worry about is that we may still get an extreme cold weather spell at some stage. And I think what has been done elsewhere, it would be great, and there is the scope within the estate to create an artificial hibernation site that the bats could use in extreme cold weathers. This has been done successfully by National Parks and Wildlife Service in Cork, and that's exactly where the bats went in really cold weather. They went to the artificial hibernation site. So although it seems as though the Lesser Horseshoes in Moore Hall have everything they need, we still need to make them a little bit more resilient to some of the adverse weather conditions that we may be getting now due to climate change. Now, I have a great fondness for the area around Moore Hall and Carnarcon and Tower Hill, because the Trust owns one small building there, We discovered the building on the left-hand side, myself and the conservation ranger at the time, Morris, when we were surveying for lesser horseshoe bats in 1997. And again, it was easy to walk in, sneak into the back of this building and look up. We quickly saw there were lesser horseshoe bats. So tracked down the owner, and they agreed, thankfully, to sell it to us, and we restored it. And the picture on the right is the building restored, and we've obviously planted some edging to give the bats protection. And this summer we had 512 emerge, which is a phenomenal number. We were very interested over the years in where the bats were going at night and what other parts of the landscape they were using. So several years ago, we caught a few of the bats under license away from the roost, so as not to disturb them. And we gave them a little haircut between the shoulder blades and attached, using harmless surgical glue, tiny radio transmitters. And these emit a signal. So there was a different signal emitted representing 6 different bats that we caught. And then we wandered the area on foot or in the car with a receiver and an antennae, and we listened out to where the bats were traveling, where they were flying to at night. This map shows you some of the highlighted areas where we found bats spending considerable amount of time at night. Not sure if you can see, but there's a small yellow circle, and that represents in the kind of towards the center middle at the bottom, and that represents the building, our reserve. So you can see there's a large red area directly in front of the building, and one female just simply flew out of the building and straight into that woodland across a small road. And she had everything she needed there. She didn't have long flights to undertake, and probably heavily, towards pregnancy, the end of pregnancy then. So she was saving her energy. So she spent a lot of time in that area. But you can see that there are red dots elsewhere, some quite far up, several kilometers away. You might be able to spot that there are blue squares, and these represent buildings where the bats hung out at night. So we call these night roosts. So these are structures that are close to where they're feeding, and it's simply a resting site for them. So rather than them having to track all the way back to the day roost, to the main roost, to rest up and digest their food, they can hang up in another building, save the energy, and maybe just return at dawn. I want to draw your attention, again, I'm not sure if the cursor will move, but draw your attention to this section here, because this is Moor Hall. And not only did we find bats foraging around Moor Hall from here, but also one or two of them spent a number of nights there. So although we tend to think of Tower Hill Cottage as the Trust's reserve protected site and Moor Hall as the Council's protected Lesser Horseshoe site, and they're all part of a special area of conservation, the bats consider them all as one and will move as they wish from one to the other. The habitat around Moor Hall and other lesser horseshoe roosts throughout the country along the west coast, it's depicted by this, and this is the kind of habitat that we need to retain in order to keep the bats in the area. So narrow roads, no street lights, and you've got really good vegetation. And when we were radio tracking one of the females, we could hear her approaching from the left-hand side where the Tower Hill Cottage is, and Moor Hall is on the right-hand side of this road. And we were able to stand in the middle of the road, and although we couldn't see her because it was dark, we could hear the signal coming from her little radio transmitter as she flew across and over our heads into the woodland at Moor Hall. And then on the left, some of you who are familiar with Moor Hall, you'll know that this is part of the estate. And again, just to stress the importance of vegetation for lesser horseshoes when they're flying around. Now, I did mention earlier that not all of the buildings used by lesser horseshoes are ruins, and this is a magnificent building in southern Poland, where lesser horseshoes hibernate in the basement, the underground area, which is vast, which was used for horses. They stored their horses down there, so it's quite a large area. And then there's an attic space, a vast attic space. And this is one castle, but there are a number of beautiful churches in the same area, and all of them had one thing in common, is that they had lesser horseshoes, but also the roofs were in disrepair. So a number of our bank colleagues in Poland got together and they made a life application, and they were able to get funding to do capital works on these buildings to protect the buildings themselves because of their own intrinsic value, but also to ensure that they would be there for the bats in time to come. And I want to draw your attention to the bottom right, where you'll see there's a modern structure, and this is an interpretive centre or a visitor centre. It has the usual souvenir shop, tea shop, and toilets. But an additional feature that it has, which just blew my mind, was you walk into this darkened room and you sit down and you put on a headset and you're brought through a virtual trip of the visit to the castle as a bat. So you're flying through the building, through the ages, and you're attending a banquet, and you're flying behind a maid as she's bringing down a platter of food, and she's opening the door and then looks behind and lets out a scream because she sees a bat approaching. So although the narration was in Polish, I didn't need to understand it to know her reaction, because that is quite a common reaction to people. I know that there's very good interpretive awareness raising being done by the County Council since they took over Moore Hall, and I've been commenting on some of that, and unfortunately I've not been able to go out and see it because of our travel restrictions, but maybe at some stage the council will be able to look at adding this feature. And with such a history associated with the Moore family, we could have people touring the estate as a lesser horseshoe bat, and maybe even flying out over the lake Lough Cara to Castle Island, where the ashes of George Moore are interred. So there's a rich history there. The Life programme did not just do capital works, they engaged with the community. They had various key rings showing a stylised horseshoe bat looking down at one of the churches that would have been renovated. And a lot of the guest houses and restaurants also supported the project. And if they did so, they were given a plaque to place outside their property to show that everybody could see the value to tourism there was in having the bats around. With lovely footage we could incorporate. This is a very short piece of video recorded at one of our at Tower Hill, and I'm hoping it works. The sound you hear, the melodic warble over the bat detector, and we could certainly use some of this if we were to do a virtual visit. I mentioned earlier that George Moore was involved with W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory, and there's another factor that connects those people, and it's the Lesser Horseshoe Bat. This is Thorvally Lee, which was owned by W.B. Yeats, and it's where his family stayed at various times, and it's where he wrote some of his poetry. And it is a lesser horseshoe roost in summer. It's now managed by the local community group, so we have lesser horseshoes linked with W.B. Yeats. This is a beautiful building that was restored, and it's within Coolgarryland Nature Reserve, which is managed by National Parks and Wildlife Service. And this building was renovated, and it is now a lesser horseshoe summer roost. So we've got a link between lesser horseshoes and Lady Gregory. And then we moved on into Limerick, and this is a fabulous ruin of Currachase House. And this is owned and managed by Quilcha. And again, there are lesser horseshoes here. They're in the basement in the wintertime hibernating, and then they fly across the courtyard in summer to a building provided for them by Quilcha as a summer roost. And this was the home of the De Vere family for 300 years. And the most famous of those was the poet Aubrey de Vere. And he spent time here, and his contemporary Tennyson spent time here. So once again, we have a strong literary link with lesser horseshoes. But obviously, I couldn't give a talk about bats on October the 31st without referring to another famous Irish writer, Bram Stoker. And without doubt, his book, published in 1897, is one of the most popular stories about vampires. But I want to draw your attention to the image on the other side of this slide. And this depicts an image from a wonderful book by David Brown. It's an American publication, and it's called Vampiro, the Vampire Bat in Fact and Fantasy, because there are, in fact, 3 species of actual vampire bat, but they never occurred in Transylvania. they never were found in any parts of Europe. You need to go to tropical Mexico, Central and South America. But the existence of these bats was well known in Europe by the 1890s, when Bram Stoker was composing his wonderful book. Now, we'll never know if Stoker knew about the vampire bats themselves, but he was very aware of the rich folklore, vampirism from other parts of the world, including Europe, but also extending over to Greece and China and India. And he was very aware of Vlad the Impaler, the notorious bloodthirsty Romanian prince who called himself Dracul. So in folk stories, vampires did take the form of animals, but not bats that often. That was really the connection made by Bram Stoker. And I think really it took hold with the film version of his book in 1931 with Bela Lugosi, in which he takes the form of a bat, not once, but 7 times. So that certainly cemented our association with bats and vampirism. So I think that's an appropriate place to finish, and to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was such an interesting talk, and just going by the chat and the number of questions in the Q&A, I think all our attendees are in agreement. So we've got quite a few questions actually. So I might just start with one that's at the top, where it's got the most upvotes. So you mentioned bats don't breed every year due to weather. Does this happen frequently? Does it impact numbers greatly? And is climate change making a noticeable difference? So quite a big question there.
Well, we know that not every bat, not every female will breed every year. Usually they do, but they can take time. They can take time off. A bat's life is all about energy balance. Now we're conscious of saving energy and conserving energy, but for bats it's survival. So yes, the weather conditions when the females become pregnant. Now, there was a lot I couldn't say about bats during the course of the talk, but male and female bats mate in the autumn, but the females delay pregnancy. The horseshoe bats store the sperm in their body and nourish it over the winter to survive, because there's nothing for them to feed on during the winter. It's a bad time to become pregnant. So their pregnancy kicks off in the spring when food becomes available again. And if we have a good spring, as we had this year, where you have really good weather, sustained period of good weather, lots of insects, the pregnancy will commence and continue, and they'll give birth, and there'll be plenty of food available for her to suckle her young. But in extremely cold springs, the pregnancy may be halted, so they can actually put a stop. So if it starts off well and then the weather disimproves, they can put the pregnancy on hold for a short period. But if that's extended, then they will actually have abortions, and that's to ensure that the adults will survive to the next year to breed again. So bats are all about balancing energy at all times of the year. And yes, when we have really bad summers, you can see over time, and this is why the National Parks and Wildlife Service does the long-term monitoring, because we have to take a long-term view of something as long-lived as a bat, because they can live 10, 15. There's a record of over 16 years for lesser horseshoes in Ireland. So we need to take a long-term view, but there's no question that the unpredictability of the weather now is affecting bats.
Okay. So then, just a general question up here. What is the most common bat found in Mayo?
It's probably the pipistrelles. We have 2 species of pipistrelle, soprano and common pipistrelle. Soprano is more associated with aquatic habitats, so Mayo is blessed with fabulous wetlands and lakes. So it would probably the soprano pipistrelle. Now we have several thousand lesser horseshoe bats, but that's a small number. The entire population in Ireland is 13,000, so Mayo would have a good percentage of those. Not as many as say Clare and South Galway or down into Kerry, but still a very, very important population.
Okay. And we have, a question, I think you answered it in the talk. Does the horseshoe bat live in colonies or is solitary? I guess maybe does it
Colonial.
change throughout the year or?
They are colonial, and the females form these colonies because they can keep the young at the center of the clusters if it's cold, because until the pup is a couple of days old, they don't have fur in their body, they're not able to thermoregulate. So if it's cold, the females will cluster together and create their own little microclimate for the bats. The photograph I showed was I showed of the bats hibernating. Although they were together, they weren't on top of each other, so they do hang singly usually. But bats are generally colonial. Yeah.
Okay. So is it difficult to repair these buildings while the bats are resident?
Yes, it is. We have in the past, the buildings that we've taken on, they've been abandoned or they were used by small numbers. So we need to do the work in the wintertime when they're not present. And that adds difficulties because builders tend not want to be doing building work in the months of December, January, February, but that's when we need to do the work. We used to be able to say that the bats are not going to be in the lesser horseshoes are not going to be in the buildings in the wintertime. They'll move out and go elsewhere. But in the more southerly areas, for example, down in Kerry, we have 8 reserves down in Kerry. Because of the mild winters generally down there, we're finding the bats are finding conditions just perfect all year round in the buildings. So they move up into the attics in the summertime, where the heat will build up and it'll be perfect for giving birth and rearing their young. And then come the mild winters, they simply fly down the stairway and they hang in the ground floor because it's about 8 degrees centigrade. So that does proves a difficulty for us, but that's the bat's choice. But thankfully, when we did repair our buildings, we did them to a very, very high standard. So it's just ongoing maintenance that we need to do, and we can usually find a time nipping in and out to do it without disturbing them.
Sorry, I guess it's about keeping on top of all the work rather than letting the building go to rack and ruin, and then it's a much bigger job.
Yes.
We have Linda Huxley, who's done a lot of work down around Lough Cara. She is mentioning a cave at Doon Peninsula and wondering, has it ever been checked for hibernating lesser horseshoes? Linda said she's been in the cave in summer and never seen them there. And she just wants to say the talk has been fascinating.
Hi, Linda. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with it. I am very, very interested. If it wasn't such a bad day and if I wasn't restricted to 5 kilometers, I would be out to where Michael is, and I'd love to team up with Michael. I'm sure some of those sites have been checked by the rangers, but it's strange. When I started to survey for bats and I went into these archaeological structures, the souterrains that are passages underground, and I was seeing lesser horseshoe bats because I was looking for them. And then there was an eminent archaeologist at one stage questioned me and said, well, I've never seen lesser horseshoes in a souterrain. And I went, don't think you were looking for one. So it's a case of knowing what to look for, and if they're there, you'll see them because they will be hanging free.
We've got a couple of questions. I don't know, did you answer it about, with global warming, do we expect the habitat range of the lesser horseshoes to extend northwards? I don't know, I can't recall whether you mentioned that earlier.
No, I didn't. No, we didn't do that specifically. Yeah, I've a number of years ago, I looked at some of the modelling predictions for Ireland, and I was thinking, well, if I lived another maybe 100 years, I might actually be seeing lesser horseshoes in Fermanagh. Because there's fantastic habitat there and there are fantastic caves, but it gets much colder there much earlier, as I know because I'm from the border counties. So I know that it's colder there in October. You get much stronger frosts and they persist well into April and May. So maybe in time it will, but it's not just about the temperature. It's about the structures that they have access to. And also, it's very importantly, it's the landscape. So we need the 3 things to work together. We need the warming, but we'll also need available buildings, but we'll also need to have the landscape that they're happy to navigate and commute around. And we do need to keep control of the amount of artificial lighting we have.
Okay. Yeah, so that question came from Terry Mosley, who's from the new Dark Sky Park up in the, I can't remember the name of the mountain range. Somebody might give it to me there. The Sperrins, yeah. So I think maybe that's where the question came from. Maybe he's hoping that they'll get lesser horseshoe bats. We might just finish on the next question, which actually is about lighting. And you just mentioned it there. And somebody has a Friedel Pass has asked, what type of lighting is less harmful for the bats? Using amber or red light, depending on the type of bat.
There's a lot of research in that area at the moment, and unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a perfect answer, because what will suit one species of bat may not suit another species with different foraging or commuting needs, and may not also suit invertebrates. We cannot forget. Obviously, I'm focused on bats, but there's a whole range of nocturnal wildlife out there that's also influenced by artificial light. So I wouldn't be in a position to say what is definite. The research is ongoing. I think in what I would advise is just if there is an important roost, then you use no light.
Yeah.
Use it so that it is not spilled. There is no spillage. Or you can put a cowl over the lights so that it doesn't spread. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to give an exact answer to that.
No, that's perfect.
As far as I know, there isn't one just at the moment. There's a lot of research underway at the moment.
And I think it's an important point to make about not using lighting. You know, we're very dependent upon, you know, artificial light now, and we can just bring a torch with us to some places, you know, rather than depending on the lights being put there for us.
Yeah, and when we were able to do bat walks, I mean, I'd always say to people, bring a torch with you, but I would be growling at people to turn them off, because we've pretty good night vision, but as soon as you turn on a light, it's gone. So I'm very much anti-artificial light in the countryside.
Yeah, like us all here in Mayo Dark Skies. I think we could be here all day with the number of questions that are coming in. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe you can answer them just directly in the questions and answers, because there's some great questions coming in there. So thank you so much, Kate. It's been a great talk. And we'll leave you go.
Okay, and I'm really enjoying the first talk was brilliant, and I'm enjoying the rest. Looking forward to the rest, and good luck to everybody and yourselves.